Hi, class. So we're going to be continuing our unit on the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to first start talking a little bit about how the Industrial Revolution spreads from Britain to the rest of the world, and we're also going to talk about its impact on society, on different groups in society, and how it basically transformed across the world. Right. So first, Britain. Obviously, that I said in our previous lesson, it started there. The Industrial Revolution started there. And Britain really wanted to keep it secret how its various machines had been made, those different inventions that I mentioned in our previous lesson. So there were visitors, though. There were people who traveled to Britain, and they actually learned about those machines through their travels. And they ended up taking the techniques that they learned back home. So sometimes people would smuggle machines out in rowboats and actually physically take them, and others actually memorized different plans, different factory and machine plans, and when they got home, they would build them based off their memory. So the first countries after Britain to develop factories and railroads were and to industrialize were Belgium, Switzerland, France, and the states that would unify to become Germany. And this all took place between the 1830s and the 1850s. So building a national railroad system really was an essential part of industrializing, as trains could transport raw materials and coal and other natural resources to factories at a much quicker and accelerated rate, right? And industrialization really came to the United States in 1789. That was the year that a man named Samuel Slater, he left Britain for the state of Rhode Island, and that's where he set up the very first textile factory on American soil. So he couldn't really bring any notes or plans from Britain. So what he did is he set up the factory based off his memory. And once factories like his were built, railroad construction in America followed. It boomed. It grew very quickly from the 1830s to the 1870s. The Industrial Revolution really took off and was seen. The effects were seen in the American Civil War, which took place between 1861 and 1865, and this was the first truly industrial war because in this war, factories mass-produced supplies and weapons for the war effort. Troops were transported by railroad, and the telegraph, which was one of those inventions of the Industrial Revolution, it was used to send very fast communications back and forth. The increasingly urbanized and factory-based North was fighting against the South, which was more agriculture-based. And as we know, the North was victorious, right? And after the war, industrialization grew explosively. And by 1900, the United States actually had overtaken Britain in manufacturing. And the United States ends up producing about 24% of the world's output of manufacturing. So 4 decades before this all happened, both Russia and Japan had given up their feudal systems, and they wanted to compete in industrialization as well. In Japan, the monarchy was pretty flexible, flexible enough to survive early industrialization. But in Russia, which was a rural country, the Tsar, who was the emperor, right, and the nobles, the aristocrats, they tried to industrialize the country while maintaining a grip on their power, right? And we'll see how that goes later on. So here is an image. This is children working in a mill in Macon, Georgia, in 1909, in one of those mill factories, right? So some consequences of the Industrial Revolution. As industrialization took off in Europe and the Americas, nations began to use their strong armies and navies to colonize many parts of the world that were not yet industrialized. The industrialized nations then began exploiting colonies for their natural resources, labor, and for potential new markets, customers, right? And this would lead to the age of new imperialism, which we will definitely talk about more in detail later. But the negative consequences of these activities would be felt for generations. The effects of industrialization on global population was staggering, right? In 1700, before fossil fuels were in use, the world's population was 670 million. By 2011, it was 6.7 billion, which is a tenfold increase in only 300 years. In the 20th century alone, the 1900s, the world's economy grew 14 times larger. Income grew almost 4 times larger, and the use of energy expanded at least 13 times larger. So, this kind of growth had never occurred before in human history, right? And many people around the world today enjoy the benefits of industrialization. With extra energy flowing through the system, many of us do today much less physical labor than earlier generations did. Another effect, child mortality rates have decreased. And what I mean is the death of children, right, at young ages while they're children, that those rates have decreased. They've gone down as more people are able to feed their children and to get access to medical care. Life expectancy, so how long you're expected to live, has increased, with the largest gains having occurred after the 1850s. Many people vote and participate in modern states, and these states provide education, social security, and health benefits. Large numbers of people enjoy levels of wealth, health, education, travel, and life expectancy that was really unimagined before the Industrial Revolution. So, the benefits, though, of industrialization, as you can see in some of the ones I've mentioned just now, they have come at a great cost. For one thing, the rate of change is now so rapid and quick that individuals, people, and social systems are really struggling to keep up with it. Also, the natural resources that industrialization depends on are being undermined. Humans continue to use fossil fuels at rates that exceed the time that it takes for these resources to be replenished, right? So, the burning of these fuels also leads to environmental impacts like climate change, which will continue to impact the earth for generations. So there are some drawbacks to it as well. So let's talk a little bit more about industrial life, how it transformed life in Britain and transformed the British economy and had consequences for people in every corner of the world. So through the Industrial Revolution, even though the Industrial Revolution started in Britain in its factories, its innovations were really entangled globally. So we often think of coal, steam engines, cheap cotton, clothes, steel, and agricultural advances as the seeds that grow into the Industrial Revolution, as I mentioned in our previous lesson. But they were less likely separately grown seeds, right? Instead, they're more like nuts, bolts, and wires. They all come together, right? All these things came together and they created connections and links that enabled this massive change in how humans work and live. So, how did these entanglements shape the lives of people in Britain? And how did these changes ripple around the world? And we're going to start by, looking at how industrial production changed British economics, labor, and culture. And then we'll go global and look at how 3 industrial commodities have changed communities, production, and trade all over the world. So it's important to realize that different people in different places experienced the changes of the Industrial Revolution in different ways. Some wealthy and middle class people, like in Northwestern Europe, they really benefited, enjoying new wealth and opportunity. For people in Europe's colonies, though, industrialization brought new and painful exploitation as European imperialists wanted to maximize profits, right? And for the working poor in industrialized countries like Britain, it was a pretty mixed bag. Working conditions and life expectancy dropped for most people moving to cities in the 1800s, in the 19th century. So here on the right is the skyline. This picture is a skyline of Manchester, England. So by the 1800s, Manchester had become the heart of British textile manufacturing. And the factories of industrialization that you see here really transformed the skyline of Manchester. So we can thank the Industrial Revolution for all this new, shiny, new technology that we have today, for cotton underwear, right, which is a lot better than having scratchy wool underwear. We can get fresh fruit in winter almost anywhere on Earth, right? So these are some of the benefits. But for the people living through it, back when it was first happening, when industrialization was first taking place, especially poor workers, the Industrial Revolution was kind of degrading and dehumanizing. The millions of working poor who moved to cities, who migrated to cities, found a dismal life. They were exploited as wage laborers. The poet William Blake, he famously referred to the factories of Britain's Industrial Revolution as these quote unquote dark satanic mills. So, and he wasn't alone in expressing horror at industrialization. A man named Friedrich Engels, who was the son of a German businessman, he visited England as a young man, and what he saw there during the Industrial Revolution really inspired him to write this book called The Condition of the Working Class in England. And in it, he concluded that English workers were not being treated as human beings. He said, one of the quotes is, they were merely toiling machines in the service of the few aristocrats who had guided history down to that time. So in other words, though the Industrial Revolution improved conditions for the middle class, it mostly enriched a few people at the expense of the many. So here is a cotton mill spinning room that you can see from 1911, right? Well, again, just so you can get a feel of what some of these factories might have looked like. So Engels, Friedrich Engels, his analysis really wasn't just about economics either. The Industrial Revolution destroyed communities and culture. The patterns of rural life were shattered by so many people moving to cities to work in factories. So people were moving from the countryside to the city. And that meant that, extended family communities, which normally in villages, they would help to ensure stability, right? They helped to provide a safety net for people. Extended families did. But as rural farmers became urban wage workers, wage laborers in factories, extended family communities were replaced by nuclear families. And these nuclear families often were just mom, dad, and the kids. That was it. And often the dad was away at work all day long, literally all day long, way more than 8 hours. He was gone maybe 16 hours, 12 hours. And often these nuclear families would just have the single parent at home, the mother with the kids. And I'll talk more about the kids in a second. So without the stability of extended family, urban families, nuclear families, they really lacked support in times of crisis, right? When they ran into issues, problems. And this meant that a lot of them went into poverty and became homeless for many of them because they didn't have as much support as they did when they were living in rural communities. So the disintegration of family networks, extended family networks, and the rise of factories really also endangered children and also unmarried women. So early 19th century England, so early 1800s, had over 1 million child laborers. Many of them made their way from orphanages, right? They were once orphans, to workhouses, factories. Some historians estimate that up to 15% of England's industrial workforce were children. And some children were forced to work for no money in exchange for just food and a bed to sleep in. Women's lives changed as industrialization moved production out of the home. So in rural England, women they would spin textiles for use at home, right? And for sale at the market. Remember the cottage industry, right? And women also worked in agriculture and domestic service. And the Industrial Revolution really didn't change the work that women did. It just changed where they did the work. So One of the few opportunities for women to improve their financial status was to work in factories, often in textile production. And another effect, married women often left the workforce, usually because their husbands demanded that they do that, or because they had really few opportunities of rewarding work besides working in factories, right? That was all they really were able to do. If they were working outside the home, it was in factories, and many of them, they left the workforce because they didn't want to do that. And this time was also the Industrial Revolution provided some degree of social mobility, right? Despite all these problems that I've talked about just now, the Industrial Revolution opened up new opportunities for new people. Even though factory life was brutal and dangerous, but people had their reasons for leaving their farms and moving to the city. For some people, urban wage labor, so living in cities, working in cities, in factories, for pay, that provided them a chance at social mobility and financial freedom, right? Being able to improve their social class or status. The Industrial Revolution made some social progress precisely because of the misery that it produced. Britain became the wealthiest nation on earth during this time. And soon, because of this, British workers, politicians, and writers, they started looking around and wondering, why, if we're the richest country in the world, why do so many people live and work in such poor conditions? And these questions, these people who were questioning this, they were sowing the seeds of the very first reform movements that really pushed children out of those factories and into public education. Public education, I'll talk about this more later, is one of those big innovations that comes about because of the Industrial Revolution. Reformers who saw all these problems, they fought for a minimum wage. They wanted safe working conditions and an 8-hour workday, a limit to how long your boss could make you work, 8 hours, and other causes as well. However, these reforms often did not spread to the colonized world, where Britain was putting lots of people to work extracting raw materials, like in India, right? Here on the right is a child laborer, a child worker in a textile mill in this is in New England in the United States in 1910, which is not all that long ago, just 110 years ago. Children she looks maybe about like 8, 9 years old, working in a textile factory, and often these machines could cause you to lose a finger, to lose an arm, a leg. They were dangerous. So production and profit in one part of the world during the Industrial Revolution relied on extraction and exploitation in another part of the world. So in order to understand this, let's first look at the impact of the Industrial Revolution on 3 global commodities like sugar, wheat, and copper. So you should, if you don't know, Europeans brought sugarcane to the Caribbean from Southeast Asia. They forced slaves to harvest and refine that sugar, and the world got addicted to sugar, and they demanded more. And at the start of the 1800s, the British government outlawed the slave trade. They said, no more trading slaves. It's illegal. And they enforced that law with gunboats, and they would travel the Atlantic Ocean on the lookout for slavers to try to put a stop to it. And this meant that sugar plantations, which relied on forced labor, they became less profitable. And in response, European colonizers and financiers, they took their business to Southeast Asia instead, where sugar had originally gotten its start. So the Dutch East Indies, which is today in Indonesia, that's the Dutch East Indies were a colony. Indonesia was a colony of the Netherlands. They were especially productive, and the Dutch forced the colonized peoples there to turn their farms toward sugar production. And the Dutch built sugar factories on an industrial scale there, and farmers there became wage laborers, and farms became sugar factories. So forcing people in the Indian Ocean to grow sugar, it didn't just hurt those people. It also devastated Caribbean societies that had relied on sugar. Enslaved people in some Caribbean islands may have been freed, right? They were no longer slaves, but they still needed cash crops like sugar to sell on the global market. So, the rise of industrial sugar production in the Indian Ocean, it drove prices down and it actually devastated, destroyed Caribbean economies. Um, some historians argue that wheat, which is what is used to make bread, right? Wheat, as much as coal, powered England's factories. So coal obviously fed the machines, as we learned yesterday, but wheat fed the workers and who worked in those factories. Global wheat production was revolutionized in the 1800s to feed English workers. Um, in the early 19th century, bread prices had increased, they were soaring. And this created unrest in Britain's cities, where a bunch of working class people now lived and depended on cheap bread. They needed to have access to cheap bread. So the British, they decided, if they want to keep the factories open, the British are going to need cheap bread. And their efforts to import more wheat to create cheaper bread transformed wheat producing regions around the world, especially in Russia, Argentina, and California. So, British capitalists, they, for example, funded railroads in southern Russia near the Black Sea. So, this made it easier to get Russian wheat to British ships in the port of Odessa. British demand for cheap wheat transformed this part of Russia into one of the world's major wheat producers. Russian peasant farmers were connected to English wage laborers by hundreds of miles of rail tracks, right? So in Argentina, British financiers, they also funded railroads there and ports and transformed subsistence farms into industrial wheat farms there. And in California, where we are, nearly all wheat exports made the 17,000-mile sea voyage from San Francisco to Liverpool, England. And this trade, this lucrative exchange, and the British financing that came with it changed California's landscape. Gold miners in California became wheat farmers, and vast stretches of central California became wheat fields because of this. And here is the port of Odessa in Russia in 1890, right? One of those ports where wheat would have been taken. It was grown in Russia, in southern Russia, taken from here, from the port, and sailed to England, where it would be turned into bread, right, to help feed the factory workers during the Industrial Revolution in England. And copper is the next one. That's the last commodity. So for thousands of years, humans had smelted metal ore like copper near where it was mined. Historians have explained that industrialization changed that. The city of Swansea in Wales was a center of British copper smelting. It had always gotten its copper from mines that were nearby the city. Around 1830, steamships, newly invented steamships, right? Steam is part of the Industrial Revolution. Around 1830, steamships made it possible for Swansea to import copper ore from around the world, from the Caribbean, from South America, Australasia, Southern Africa, Algeria, the United States, and even Canada. So this tiny corner of Wales, Swansea, became the center of the global copper trade, and it touched nearly every continent on Earth. So on the right here, you see this is Bristol Company Copper Works. This is what it is. It looked like near Swansea in 1811. It's a drawing. So by the mid-19th century, by the mid-1800s, Swansea produced about 50% of the world's copper. Its copper network included and relied on enslaved Africans, indigenous Americans, Chinese indentured laborers, British and Indian financiers, bankers, right, and sailors from all over the world. And they were all connected to satisfy Britain's demand for this metal, this orangish metal, which is copper. And copper also connected with the wheat and sugar industries. The steam engines that moved sugar and wheat around the world relied on copper components. So copper vats were really essential, for example, for refining sugar. The demand for copper basically transformed Swansea into a landscape reeking of sulfur and choked with smoke from copper furnaces, right? So here is an old copper vat in an abandoned sugar mill in the British Virgin Islands. So each of these three industries, sugar, wheat, and copper, they all depended on British steam engines, British financial systems, wage laborers. In each of these cases, from British children forced to work in factories, to the colonial subjects forced to farm sugar, to the peasant farmers of southern Russia, to the thousands of forced and free laborers who smelted copper, the global connections that were forged by the Industrial Revolution kind of restructured local communities and trade networks and the lives of workers around the world. So let's talk a little bit about, industrialization's impact on people and the movement of people. So in the 1800s, people moved from place to place like they never had before. And some of this migration was local and some of it was long distance. Much of it was voluntary, so people chose to leave. But forced migration continued for more than 100 years after the start of this era. So the 1800s, they saw a series of massive migrations, larger than had ever been witnessed before. Millions of people were on the move between 1750 and 1914. These movements helped to tie the world together in new ways. So take a look at the chart below. These four rows detail some of the largest migration patterns in this era. Migration from one region to another was happening all over the world during this time. But there were several major migration bumps that were bigger and more significant than the everyday migration patterns among regions. So let's see, what do each of these bumps signify? So at the beginning of the 1800s, the Atlantic slave trade was still operating. That meant millions of enslaved Africans were unwillingly being brought to the Americas. But after 1830, this system began to slow down. More and more countries made it illegal to engage in the slave trade. And migrations of Europeans to the Americas picked up just as the Atlantic slaving system was slowing. The population of Europe was surging in the 19th century, right? And it would double from 188 million in 1800 to 400 million by 1900. And as a result, the continent had trouble sustaining so many people. So many Europeans, they also lost land to industrialization. Urban workers who had trouble making ends meet in European cities, they began to seek new opportunities in the Americas, which explains that bump that you see there of Europeans moving their destination as the Americas, right? During the same period, another great movement started in Asia. The populations of China and India were also surging. Many citizens of both those countries sought new opportunities in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, governments in Russia and China encouraged their populations to settle in places like Siberia and Central Asia, partly because each country wanted to claim territory in these regions. So these migration patterns that I discussed hide perhaps the greatest migration of this time. This migration was not from one country or region of the world to another. Instead, it was from countryside to city, which is known as rural to urban migration. So look at this list of the world's largest cities and their population in 1800. So you see Beijing, London, Canton, Istanbul, Paris. You see the largest cities, Beijing with 1.1 million. And then look on the right. This is a list of world's largest cities in 1900. You see London now with 6.6 million, New York 4.2 million, Paris 3.3 million. If you compare the first list to the second, several things are obvious. One is the rise of large cities in the Americas and Europe. That huge population boom in Europe and those migration trends of people moving to the Americas from Africa and Europe really stand out in this list, right? When you compare the two lists. The second big trend is the immense growth of cities. Growth was especially great in the cities I've listed, but it also occurred in cities in other parts of the Americas and Asia as well. London as you can see, is 7 times as large in 1900 as it was in 1800. Paris grew 6 times as large over 100 years. And this proved that movement from rural to urban areas was clearly significant during the Industrial Revolution. So, why did people move from rural areas to urban areas? Why did they move from one region to another over the course of the 1800s? Historians often focus on what they call push and pull factors to understand migration. So push factors are things that make people want to leave or force them to leave their original area. Pull factors bring people to a new area. So over the course of the 1800s, many push and pull factors helped to create the vast migrations that we see in these statistics. So push factors often included problems or a lack of opportunity in their homeland. For example, in Europe in the 1800s, it was a very difficult place for many people to live. Many farming or peasant families were kicked off their land for industrial farming and herding. So they moved to cities where populations were growing rapidly and they were looking for work in the new factories. But often there wasn't enough work to go around. And this was mainly due to the fact that factories were really efficient precisely because they replaced people with machines, right? So they didn't actually need that many people. They needed machines and people to be able to work them. So it didn't require that many people to work in them. A number of factors pushed specific European populations to the Americas. Some migrants fled wars. For example, a long conflict in the Balkans pushed millions of people to leave there. These refugees then fled to other parts of Europe, the Ottoman Empire, to the Americas in the 1900s. Religious persecution also drove immigrants. So the Jewish population of Russia and Eastern Europe, for example, fled persecution in the millions in the late 19th century. Hunger was also an important factor. The 19th century was an age of famines. This chart you see here illustrates some of the largest famines. And these famines were not just a result of poor years when few crops grew in an area. They are actually linked to a combination of global climate changes and poor government policies. Many of these regions were colonies, and imperial rulers were really bad at making sure that their subjects, their colonial subjects, were being fed. In fact, they often continued to export food, take food away from these regions, hoping to sell it for more money elsewhere rather than feed those people in the colonies. Colonialism also helped to create a huge pull factor during this period. The demand for labor in the British Empire in particular was great. Colonial governments planned huge projects to pull out resources, especially railroads, and private companies needed workers for mines and for plantations, and often the work was really terrible, hard, dangerous, and poorly paid. And many of these were in areas that didn't have a lot of people or were where the local populations resisted working under these conditions. The British ruled India during this era. They found that they could cheaply employ their Indian subjects and draw them to these areas, especially during periods of famine. In China, poverty and sometimes famines also created push factors for laborers. Big corporations then took advantage of this, people being pushed out because of famines, and the big corporations took advantage of this and created a pull factor. So they would offer to pay to relocate people to Southeast Asia and elsewhere as cheap laborers. In fact, the kind of contracts they created for these laborers looked very much like slavery. They usually took the form of indentures, in which workers had very few rights, and basically they agreed to work for a very long time, years and years and years, for little pay. And during the early years of this period, slavery itself was a potent pull factor. Until the 1820s, the enslavement of Africans resulted in millions of people being forcibly relocated to the Americas. Most European countries technically abolished slavery in the early 19th century, but in reality, it persisted. It continued into later years. Ship owners secretly took captives from Africa as late as the 1860s. They were brought basically to work on sugar plantations in Brazil and Cuba. Africans were also enslaved into the Muslim world, at least until the early 20th century. Also, it wasn't just Africans who were enslaved. Although the number of people enslaved was much less, slavery persisted in many parts of the world through the end of the Industrial Revolution. And besides, aside from enslaved and indentured migrants, prisoners also formed another large group of forced migrants in this era. So Britain actually sent thousands of Irish and British prisoners, convicts, to Australia. And this included both alleged criminals and people who owed money. The French sent convicts and prisoners to penal colonies in Latin America. Japan sent its convicts to the island of Hokkaido, and Russia shipped like tens of thousands of prisoners to Siberia during this time. And of course, the biggest pull factor of them all was opportunity. So in the 19th century, in the 1800s, some regions seemed to provide much opportunity, and this pulled lots of voluntary migrants. Europeans, for example, saw the United States, Canada, and Latin America as having a lot of opportunity. They believed they could move to these places, find jobs, and own land. So millions of Europeans moved voluntarily to these regions. They hoped to work in factories or to get a piece of land to farm, right? If you look at the charts that I have in this presentation earlier, some patterns are obvious. Others, though, are not, and that's largely because they're missing patterns. Yet missing patterns can tell us a lot too. So for example, you might ask, like, why was immigration from Asia to the Americas not larger in this period? We know there were big push factors for people to leave China and India, like famine. We also know that there was a huge opportunity pull factor in the Americas. So why weren't there more people leaving Asia and going to the Americas? And this missing pattern highlights an important immigration factor. Simply put, the governments of most American countries restricted Asian immigration. They passed laws, especially from the 1880s onward, that stopped people from some Asian countries from migrating. So these laws, also called exclusion acts, were based on racist ideas that Asians were either immoral, alien, or that they would steal jobs from whites, like white Americans. And these laws were powerful factors that actually limited immigration in this era from some regions to others. And you can see on the right here, this is an Australian anti-Chinese immigrant cartoon from 1886. And propaganda like this helped to stir up racist anti-Chinese sentiment in the Americas and Australia during this time period. So that's going to be it for this lesson. Let me know if you have any questions and I'll try to help you out and clear some things up.